hundreds of meters beneath the ocean's surface, the world is reduced to pressure, darkness, and sound. No sunlight reaches this depth. No radio signals penetrate it. And once a submarine descends this far, it exists completely detached from the surface world. Inside the steel hull, every noise matters. The soft hum of machinery, the slow rhythm of propulsion, the faint, almost imperceptible sounds that do not belong. Down here, silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is discipline. During the Cold War, this silent environment became the most dangerous place on Earth. Not because of explosions or open confrontation, but because of how close rivals were willing to come without being seen. There were moments when two submarines passed so near to each other that a slight change in depth or speed could have ended both missions instantly. Not with violence, not with warning, but with irreversible consequences. Years later, long after the crews involved had returned to the surface, analysts uncovered something extraordinary. A fragment of recorded data, captured at a distance, where recording should have been impossible. A piece of evidence, quietly revealing
how far one side had gone to understand the other. This recording did not trigger alarms. It did not appear in newspapers. It did not alter policy overnight. But it forced a fundamental rethinking of what was believed to be possible beneath the ocean.
This was not a conventional operation. It was not about dominance through force. It was about proximity, patience, and restraint pushed to its absolute limit. The mission responsible for this discovery was never officially celebrated. It existed in fragments, whispered references, and carefully worded declassified reports. Its name was Operation Ghost Fleet, and it represented a hidden chapter of the Cold War, a contest fought not with weapons, but with silence, where the most critical decisions were made by individuals who understood that being detected was often more dangerous than being destroyed. Before we explore how this operation worked, or what it revealed, one question must be answered. Why would any nation deliberately risk placing its submarines so close to a rival, knowing that a single miscalculation could reshape global stability? The answer lies in the Cold War battlefield no one could see. During the Cold War, the most visible symbols of power were easy to recognize: intercontinental missiles, strategic bombers, military parades designed to be seen, measured, and feared. But the true balance of global stability rested on something far less visible.
Submarines. Hidden beneath thousands of tons of moving water, nuclear-powered submarines represented a form of deterrence unlike anything before them. They were not meant to strike first. They were designed to survive long enough to ensure retaliation if everything else failed. This concept became known as the second strike.
As long as a nation could guarantee that some of its nuclear capability remained hidden and operational, no adversary could safely risk escalation. The logic was cold, mathematical, and deeply unsettling. And it depended entirely on one assumption: that these submarines could not be found. Above the ocean's surface, diplomacy attempted to manage tension through treaties and communication. Below it, silence determined survival. If a submarine could be detected, tracked, or predicted, its value as a deterrent began to erode. And once that erosion started, strategic stability itself came into question. This was why the underwater domain mattered so profoundly. The ocean offered concealment, but not certainty. Sound traveled differently underwater. It bent, refracted, and carried across vast distances in unpredictable ways. Temperature layers and pressure gradients created invisible channels where noise could travel farther than anyone expected. Naval planners understood this environment was imperfect. They knew submarines were not invisible. They were simply difficult to hear, which raised a dangerous possibility.
What if difficulty was not the same as impossibility? What if, with enough patience, technology, and discipline, one side could listen without being noticed?
The Cold War did not require victory beneath the waves. It required assurance. Each side needed to believe the other could not neutralize its ability to respond. The moment that belief weakened, calculations changed. This is why the underwater contest became so restrained and so relentless. No declarations were made. No confrontations announced. Instead, submarines followed each other silently across the depths, collecting fragments of information that would never appear in official briefings. Every movement mattered. Every sound carried risk. The ocean floor became a place where strategy unfolded in increments so small they were almost invisible. And in this unseen arena, a quiet shift began. The goal was no longer avoidance. It was understanding. If naval forces could learn how their rivals operated, how they moved, how they sounded, how they reacted under pressure, then uncertainty could be reduced. Not eliminated, reduced. That reduction, even marginal, was enough to influence doctrine, training, and long-term planning. And it was within this logic that a new approach emerged. An approach that accepted proximity as a calculated risk.
An approach that assumes silence could be maintained even at distances once considered unacceptable. This was the strategic environment that gave birth to Operation Ghost Fleet, a mission built not on confrontation but on controlled exposure. Before it could succeed, however, it required something more fragile than technology. It required people capable of operating at the edge of detection without crossing it.
The idea behind Operation Ghost Fleet did not appear overnight. It emerged quietly through patterns that analysts could not ignore. Certain submarine routes repeated more often than expected. Certain acoustic signatures appeared in similar regions, at similar depths, across different patrols. At first, these observations were treated cautiously. Correlation did not mean control, and no one wanted to assume more certainty than the data allowed. But over time, the patterns became harder to dismiss. Naval intelligence began asking questions that were deliberately uncomfortable. If submarines followed predictable behaviors, could those behaviors be learned? If sound signatures remained consistent, could they be recognized under pressure? And if recognition was possible, how close would a submarine need to be to confirm it? These questions led to a fundamental shift in thinking. Traditional doctrine emphasized avoidance. Submarines were expected to remain distant, evasive, and independent. Operation Ghost Fleet challenged that assumption. Instead of avoiding rival submarines,
select crews would deliberately seek proximity, not to confront, not to signal, but to observe.
This required more than new equipment. It required a different mindset. Commanders selected for these missions were not chosen for aggression or boldness. They were chosen for restraint. They needed to understand when not to act, when to hold position, when to accept incomplete information rather than risk exposure. Sonar officers were trained to recognize sound not as noise, but as behavior. A change in rhythm could indicate a course adjustment. A brief irregularity could suggest awareness or anxiety. Every decision on board had to consider one principle above all others.
Silence was not passive. Silence was active control. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Shadowing another submarine meant operating at distances that left no room for correction. A sudden maneuver by the tracked vessel could collapse that margin instantly. There would be no warning shots, no communications. Only the sound of moving water, and the knowledge that detection would escalate beyond the control of those involved. For this reason, Operation Ghost Fleet remained highly compartmentalized. Few crews were informed of its full scope. Fewer still understood how close missions were allowed to go. Each patrol was framed as a test, a limited objective, a controlled experiment. But every successful mission pushed boundaries further. What began as cautious observation evolved into deliberate shadowing over extended periods. Hours became days. Days became patterns. And with each successful patrol, confidence grew. Not confidence in dominance, but confidence in discipline. The submarines assigned to these missions became something different. They were not hunters. They were not shields. They were listeners. Ghosts in the ocean's background noise.
And as Operation Ghost Fleet matured, it became clear that technology alone would not determine its success. The decisive factor would always be the individual standing watch, listening to sounds no one else could hear, knowing that a single mistake could unravel years of careful restraint. The stage was set. The ocean had been mapped not by sight, but by sound. And sooner or later, that proximity would be tested.
Tracking a submarine without being detected is not a matter of speed or strength. It is a matter of patience, physics, and restraint. Beneath the surface, sound behaves in ways that defy intuition. Water carries noise far more efficiently than air. A mechanical vibration that would be insignificant on land can travel for miles underwater, bending through layers of temperature and pressure. This is why submarines do not hunt with their eyes, they hunt with their ears. But in Operation Ghost Fleet, hunting was the wrong word. Active sonar, sending out a pulse and listening for the echo, was rarely an option. It revealed position instantly. It announced presence. For shadowing missions, active sonar was a liability. Instead, crews relied on passive listening. They waited. They listened to the ocean itself, separating natural background noise from the faint signatures that indicated machinery, movement, and intent. Every submarine produced a unique acoustic profile, not because designers intended it, but because perfection was impossible. The rotation of a propeller, the resonance of internal systems, the subtle hum created by power distribution. These details combined into patterns that experienced sonar officers could recognize with remarkable precision. But recognition required clarity, and clarity required proximity. As distance closed, information improved.
As information improved, risk increased. This was the central dilemma of Operation Ghost Fleet.
Stay too far away and the data would remain incomplete. Move too close and silence could be broken. Ocean conditions added another layer of uncertainty. Thermoclines, sharp changes in water temperature, could bend sound unexpectedly, masking one moment and exposing the next. Currents shifted. Ambient noise rose and fell. What worked one day might fail the next. Crews learned to think in probabilities, not certainties. A sound detected once was an anomaly. A sound detected repeatedly became a pattern. A pattern confirmed over time became intelligence. But every step toward certainty narrowed the margin for error. Shadowing required matching speed without matching noise, adjusting depth without disturbing surrounding water, anticipating maneuvers before they occurred. All of this happened without communication. Orders were minimal. Voices were restrained. Movements were deliberate. In these conditions, human judgment mattered more than any instrument. Sonar officers learned to trust their instincts, but never fully. Commanders weighed information that was always incomplete. There was no display that showed danger approaching.
No warning light that signaled proximity had gone too far. The boundary between success and exposure was invisible. And as missions grew longer and more ambitious, that boundary was crossed not by force, but by inches.
The ocean did not announce when a limit had been reached. It simply waited for someone to misjudge it. Operation Ghost Fleet depended on the belief that silence could be maintained even as distance collapsed. Sooner or later, that belief would be tested. The moment did not begin with an alarm. There was no sudden noise, no flashing indicator, no signal that something had gone wrong. It began with absence. Inside the submarine, the sonar picture narrowed. Background noise thinned. The sound that had guided the crew for hours grew sharper, more defined. The distance between the two submarines was closing. Not intentionally, not aggressively, simply as a result of two vessels operating in the same invisible space, each following its own mission, unaware of how narrow the margin had become. At this depth, even minor changes mattered. A slight adjustment in speed, a gradual shift in depth. Movements that would be insignificant on the surface now carried serious consequences. The sonar officer noticed the change first. The acoustic signature was no longer diffuse. It was concentrated. The tracked submarine was closer than anticipated. Much closer.
Calculations updated silently. Range estimates tightened. The distance collapsed to a few dozen meters.
At that range, there was no room for error. The hulls were separated by less space than the length of the vessel itself. Any unexpected maneuver by either submarine could result in detection or physical contact. And detection was the greater danger. A collision would end a mission. Detection would end restraint. Inside the control room, time compressed. No one spoke. Orders were not shouted. They were implied. The commanding officer understood the situation instantly. Remaining at the current depth risked being heard. Breaking away too quickly risked producing noise that would reveal position. There was no option without risk. The decision had to be made. Without confirmation. Without consultation. Without certainty. Seconds mattered.
The commander chose the smallest possible adjustment. A subtle change in depth, measured in meters, not tens of meters. Enough to alter the acoustic profile, not enough to disturb the surrounding water. The submarine responded slowly, deliberately. Inside the hull, systems remained steady. No sudden changes. No unnecessary movement.
For a brief moment, the distance remained unchanged. Then, gradually, the sound softened. The track submarine passed. It never knew how close it had come to being followed. It never signaled awareness. It never altered its course. But during those seconds, the balance of the mission hung on a single judgment. Had the decision been delayed, the acoustic signature would have sharpened further. Had the adjustment been larger, the surrounding water would have carried the disturbance outward. Either outcome could have triggered detection protocols. Detection would not have remained local. A sonar contact at that depth would have led to alerts. Alerts would have escalated command decisions, and those decisions would not have been made by the people inside the submarine. They would have been made far above the surface. This was the reality of Operation Ghost Fleet. The danger was not in what the crew intended to do. It was in what could happen if silence failed. As the distance increased and the immediate risk passed, something else became clear.
During that near collision, data had been captured. Not intentionally, not as part of a planned maneuver, but as a consequence of proximity pushed to its absolute limit. A recording taken where no recording was supposed to be possible. The crew did not celebrate. There was no acknowledgment. The mission continued. But the implications of what had just occurred would take years to fully understand. What mattered about that near collision was not the danger itself. Danger had always been part of submarine operations. What made this moment different was what it revealed. The data captured during that brief window of proximity was unlike anything collected before. Not because it was louder, not because it was clearer, but because it was contextual. It recorded how a submarine behaved when it was unknowingly at the edge of detection. Engine patterns, speed consistency, subtle variations in mechanical rhythm that only appear under specific conditions. This kind of information could not be simulated. It could not be requested. It could only be observed, accidentally, and at great risk.
When the patrol ended and the submarine returned to port, the data did not move quickly. It was handled quietly, reviewed carefully, compared against years of prior recordings. Analysts noticed something important. The acoustic signature remained stable even when proximity increased. There was no abrupt change, no defensive maneuver. This suggested a level of confidence or unawareness that challenged existing assumptions. It meant certain submarines operated with predictable tolerances. It meant their crews trusted concealment beyond what doctrine officially acknowledged. Over time, similar fragments from other patrols began to align. Not identical moments, not repeated scenarios, but consistent behaviors. From these patterns, broader conclusions emerged. Routes could be inferred, operating depths estimated, response thresholds better understood. None of this provided absolute certainty, but certainty was never the goal. The goal was reduction. Reducing uncertainty by even a small margin altered how naval planners thought about deterrence. Training programs adapted. Simulations changed. Crews were taught not only how to remain hidden, but how to recognize when others believed they were hidden. This intelligence did not eliminate risk. It reshaped it. The Cold War did not become safer because of Operation Ghost Fleet.
It became more controlled. And control, in a world defined by restraint, mattered more than dominance. The value of that near collision was not measured in tactical advantage. It was measured in confidence. Confidence that silence could be maintained under extreme proximity. Confidence that understanding the behavior of a rival reduced the chance of miscalculation. And confidence that the most dangerous moments were the ones no one ever acknowledged. But that confidence came at a cost.
Because collecting intelligence at this level required sustained pressure on the people tasked with maintaining silence. That cost would never appear in reports. It would be carried by the crews themselves. The most difficult part of Operation Ghost Fleet was not the technology. It was endurance. Submarines were built to withstand pressure. People were not. Life beneath the surface unfolded in cycles that blurred together. There was no sunrise to mark the passage of time, no horizon to signal movement, only routines. Watch shifts repeated. Meals arrived on schedule. Sleep came in fragments. For sonar officers, the world narrowed to sound. Hours were spent listening to patterns that never fully repeated. Distinguishing between harmless background noise and signals that demanded attention required absolute focus. There was no room for distraction, no allowance for fatigue. A single misinterpretation could escalate beyond the control of everyone on board. Commanders carried a different burden. Every decision had consequences they could not fully predict. They operated with incomplete information, knowing that hesitation could be as dangerous as action.
They were trained to maintain composure, but composure did not eliminate doubt. At close proximity, the pressure intensified. Each patrol reinforced the same awareness. They were not invisible. They were simply unnoticed. That distinction mattered. The silence they depended on could collapse without warning, triggered by forces outside their control. An unexpected maneuver, a change in ocean conditions, a decision made by someone they would never meet. This uncertainty weighed heavily. There were no celebrations after successful missions, no visible markers of achievement. Success was defined by what did not happen. No detection, no escalation, no acknowledgment. The psychological toll accumulated quietly. Crews learned to suppress reactions, to manage fear without expressing it, to carry responsibility without release. For many, the tension did not dissipate when missions ended. The habits of silence followed them back to the surface. The vigilance lingered. Sleep remained light. They could not explain their work to family or friends. They could not describe the moments from proximity narrowed to meters, and decisions were measured in seconds. Those experiences remained internal. Operation Ghost Fleet demanded not only technical precision, but emotional restraint at a level few environments required. The ocean did not forgive mistakes. Neither did the strategic environment above it. And yet, despite the strain, missions continued, not because the crews sought recognition, but because restraint itself had become the objective. In the calculus of the Cold War, stability depended on individuals willing to operate under pressure without acknowledgment, trusting that silence served a purpose larger than themselves. That burden was never recorded in intelligence summaries. It existed only in the memories of those who carried it. For years, the recording remained just another entry in a classified archive. It was not labeled as extraordinary. It did not trigger urgent reviews.
At the time it was captured, no one aboard the submarine understood its significance. Only later, when patterns were compared, when assumptions were tested, did its importance become clear. The recording revealed something doctrine had long denied.
It showed how close silence could be pushed without breaking, indication of awareness. For analysts, this was unsettling. It meant the margin between concealment and exposure was not fixed. It was elastic. And elasticity introduced both opportunity and danger. The data forced a reassessment of long-held beliefs. If a submarine could be shadowed this closely without realizing it, then concealment depended as much on perception as on physics.
If perception could be misjudged, then confidence could be misplaced. This realization did not lead to dramatic shifts overnight. Instead, it influenced thinking quietly. Training simulations were adjusted, risk models were refined, assumptions about proximity and response thresholds were revisited. The recording did not offer a blueprint, it offered a warning. It demonstrated how easily strategic stability could hinge on moments never intended to occur. Operation Ghost Fleet was never meant to test the limits of concealment so directly. Yet this unintended outcome became one of its most valuable contributions. Not because it encouraged greater risk, but because it revealed how little room existed for miscalculation. The recording showed that restraint had worked, but only just. It underscored a fragile truth of the Cold War beneath the ocean. Peace depended not on perfect systems, but on disciplined individuals operating within margins they could not see.
And those margins were thinner than anyone had publicly admitted. Operation Ghost Fleet never appeared in public ceremonies. There were no speeches announcing its success, no official acknowledgments of missions completed in silence. Its legacy was measured differently. It lived in doctrine manuals revised without explanation, in training programs adjusted quietly, in assumptions reconsidered behind closed doors. The Cold War beneath the ocean did not end with treaties or declarations. It faded gradually, shaped by restraint rather than resolution. Submarines continued to patrol, technology evolved, sensors became more refined, but the core principles remained unchanged. Silence was still power, proximity was still risk, and the most dangerous moments were still the ones that occurred without witnesses. Operation Ghost Fleet demonstrated that strategic stability did not depend on perfect control. It depended on understanding limits and respecting them.
The crews involved never knew how close the world may have come to escalation. They were not told. They did not need to be. Their responsibility was narrower, yet heavier: to listen, to decide, to remain unseen. Today, much of this history has been partially revealed through declassified documents and retrospective analysis. Yet even now, the full scope remains fragmented. Perhaps that is appropriate. Some conflicts are best understood not by what they produced, but by what they prevented. The silent war beneath the ocean was never about victory. It was about restraint under pressure. And in a world defined by uncertainty, restraint may have been the most powerful force of all. Because long after the Cold War ended on the surface, its quiet lessons continued to echo below, carried not by sound, but by the discipline of those who understood that silence itself